So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you everybody who's online attending. Ask me anything with the Compose team. For those who, I'm relatively new to Docker. I'm the engineering manager here for Compose team. To my right, we have Han.
Hey everybody, I am the product manager for the Compose team.
And I'm Guillaume, staff software engineer in the Compose team also.
And I'm Milas. I'm also one of the other software engineers on the Compose team.
Great.
Maybe we can see the slide.
So if you would like to ask questions, please go to the Slido link, slido.com, put in Compose AMA as the code. We'll get some questions from the online audience as well. To kick things off, we had a question about the new watch feature in Compose. And if you want to just tell us more about what does it mean that watch is now in GA?
Yeah, we're pretty excited about this. So as of the latest release of Docker Desktop 4.24, Watch, which we had previously released in alpha a couple of months back, is now generally available. And this is functionality that makes it so that you can very quickly sync your code as you're making code changes and iterating right into the container. What we had in mind for this was a use case, maybe like hot reload, where if you have a project that's not compiled code, but that would benefit from the changes that you're making being reflected right in the container, and for you to have that really fast feedback loop of seeing the changes that you're making, that watch is a mode that you can set up in that way.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things from the time that we started the preview in alpha and then went to GA is there were a couple things. So you might have seen the YAML syntax was x-develop. And so we were doing that as a way to, before we wanted to declare the format completely stable. So that was actually a big reason that we left it in preview for several months, because we wanted to make sure that we had a good syntax, everything worked for a bunch of projects and felt good, and there weren't any big changes we wanted to make. We also made a few nice performance improvements in there for sync speed, especially for big projects, or if you switch branches, for example, to make sure that it doesn't get locked up. And we also improved some of the ignore logic to avoid spurious changes from little files, temporary files that editors like to create, just to, again, really make sure that it remains snappy and that you're only doing updates and builds when something important happens.
Great. So what can we say about you gave a talk earlier today about the managing complex projects, Guillaume, and just a quick synopsis of what the new include feature with utilizing the experimental part now, which is GitHub URLs, and also the registry URLs?
And also the registry.
Yeah.
We introduced last July the include part, and so for those who don't know, you can now import directly inside an existing Compose file another one. So that way you can modularize your application and split a huge application into sub-Compose YAML file. So that way each team can be in charge of his own configuration, and the other one can use it directly and easily. And yeah, we are also working on the capability to include configuration from GitHub repository and maybe later from registry. So right now, the GitHub capability is experimental. We need to fix some stuff and be sure that we don't have any security issue using that. So you can use it via an unvariable Compose experimental Git that will allow you to include a configuration coming from Git. So what Compose will do at that time is just see that the file is remote, clone that Compose file, and what is needed to build the different services inside that compose file locally. So it will clone part of the repo inside your host machine, and then will just merge the configuration with your current one, and that way you will be able to include stuff managed maybe by, don't know, Nginx corporation directly, or the maintainer of Postgres, or we don't know the use cases right now, but that's offer huge potential new use cases. And yeah, we're also working on seeing how we can push compose file directly into registry via OCI artifact. And yeah, when that will be available, we definitely want to use that with include, being able to say, hey, I want to get that configuration directly from the hub and start my compose application with maybe stuff coming from GitHub, other stuff coming from the hub. And yeah, so you can imagine whatever you want with that new include feature right now. It's cool.
Yeah, it's part of our overall efforts to really make it easier to define really complex projects with Compose. Even though Compose is obviously used for a lot of different use cases, we've been doing a little bit of an extra push around giving a lot of flexibility for all of the different ways that people want to structure their projects, but also just the way that teams can work together on those shared projects as well.
Yeah, you can easily use include with override file or extends, so that makes the possibility very huge. That's yeah, the combination of the configuration you can do now is just amazing.
Yeah, and part of why we really want this kind of engagement and to be very available to the larger open source community is, as these additional options are available, we really want to have a good understanding of how they actually meet, or perhaps don't entirely meet the use cases of our users.
So, Han, talk about what Compose is doing for the future of the product itself.
Yeah, this is something that we've been putting a lot of investment and time in, and I think there's the investment and the respect of the open source project Compose that has been around for quite a while. I think has been something that's been very valuable to a lot of different kinds of people, ranging from home labs to much more complex use cases in organizations with multiple teams. So we're trying to understand how to both really understand the improving of certain core workflows that we observe people using with Compose. So the watch functionality we mentioned earlier on is a way that we really want to make sure that for that inner loop workflow, that as you're making changes to your code, that there's a little bit more automation. And I think the thing that we're trying to really respect is that Compose's flexibility is part of its simplicity, and flexibility is part of its strength as well. So that's why we're taking care, I think, as we're trying and releasing these features that are much more about smoothing a certain kind of a workflow that we think will, as is one of the bigger themes of the keynote earlier, just reduce that amount of friction that developers have to deal with day to day.
Yeah, and on the we've mentioned experimental a few times here, and Guillaume did mention, right, that does often mean we're still working out some of the bugs, but a lot of it is also that we're trying to really take a new approach or a slightly different approach. And again, we're not saying that it's broken or anything. We're saying that we're not committing to not making any breaking changes yet, because we know that for Compose, projects rely on it. It's important, and that stability is key, especially with making sure that your Compose file continues to work and you're not constantly having to change or make differences if a syntax changes. So we really want to be respectful of that. So we're trying to use these experimental options now to just slow down a little bit and give you the ability to opt in. If you're interested in something you want, by all means, go try it out, file GitHub issues, give us requests. That's what we're looking for, because that's what we want before we actually, mark something as GA, because once we do that, making a breaking change becomes much more difficult and a much longer change and a much longer process, which you might have seen before, for example, going between Compose version 1 and version 2.
Well, while Han gets the background back up, we have a question. Is it possible to rebuild with NPM some code in project instead of all projects with the Docker Compose watch?
Can you read that again?
Sure. Is it possible to rebuild with NPM some part of the code in the project instead of all project, instead of the whole project or multiple projects with the Docker Compose watch?
So it might depend on how your project is set up. But I guess as a core, when you're looking at especially Node projects, whether that's a backend or a front-end project using Webpack, often what works the best is to, as part of your Docker file, copy in that package JSON or yarn lock file, whichever package manager you're using, and do that install as part of your Docker build. And also you can use there some of the options around, for example, cache mounts to make sure that those packages, the downloaded versions exist in a cache mount, so that even if you need to reinstall, it's quite fast because you're not actually fetching them remotely. And so in that way, you can trigger that rebuild if you're actually changing dependencies. If you do have a large monorepo project with a bunch of sub-packaged JSONs, you might have to look at what makes the most sense. For example, if you have a parent one changing, you might need to actually rebuild everything because that's going to trickle down, which again, usually reinstalling those dependencies is quite fast if you're using a cache mount. So I'd recommend. But then other than that, usually when you're syncing in source code, a JSX file or a TypeScript file, whatever it is, if you've already set up your Docker file to run your development command, npm start, once that happens, that code will get in and you can take advantage of the fact that the JavaScript tooling is pretty incredible with hot reload and has gotten even faster and faster. You see a new tool every day competing for who's fastest at hot reload. And so you can get that with, you get a little bit of both. And if I didn't answer that, what you were asking, you have more specific, please resubmit and I will try and do better.
Here's a follow-up. For example, change some JS file in Angular project and don't wait along to rebuild project at all.
Right. So in that case, if you're changing your source file for an Angular project, if you set up a sync rule for that with Watch, and I will self-promote for later, there's going to be a talk on talking about bind mounts, volumes, and Compose Watch, at which we'll see a little bit of that. So if you synchronize in those code files from Angular, and you're using the Angular, because Angular has their own tooling for the dev mode, I don't remember the exact name of it, where it's in that watch mode as well inside of the container, that works really well. And that's where you can use a multi-stage Docker file as well. So you can have a target, for example, called dev, maybe, where that's where you run the Angular dev command, versus your production Docker file target, where you're actually bundling, minifying all the assets that you're going to deploy to a CDN or Nginx or whichever technology you're using. But for development, when you're running in Compose with the watch mode, you can use that other target that's not doing that full minification that can be quite slow and heavy, and also doesn't give you the real-time inner loop feedback when you're making changes, and just synchronize those files in and use that dev target and let the Angular tooling inside of the container take care of it. So Compose is really trying to we're trying to bridge the gap between the tooling and containers. So we know there's really, really great tooling out there. And it's not just JavaScript. For example, PHP is incredibly popular, and one of the best things about it is you edit your PHP file and it's live. So we want to make sure that you can still do that when you're working with a container, regardless of how you're doing that, whether you're using dev containers or any other technology. It's sort of agnostic have Compose say, let's use those really incredible frameworks out there inside the container and have Compose work with them to get the files there as efficiently as possible so that they can take over and do the work that they're good at and only do a, kind of a bigger rebuild in the event that you need to change dependencies, for example.
Great, thanks, Miles.
Check.
How does the include functionality relate to the build context?
Good question. At the moment, there is no link between the two. No. If you include a file with services that need to be built and you use Docker Compose Hub build, for example, that will rebuild all the images for starting the container, just because what include is doing, in fact, under the hood, it's just creating a more large configuration for you. So that's the same as having the declaration of all the services in one place. It just, for you, include just replace the fact that you had everything inside a single compose file. So that means that if you include services that need to be built and you at some point called Docker Compose build or Docker Compose up -- build to rebuild the images, those images will be also rebuilt. But that's also a good point, because when you include a compose file, you can also specify a dedicated file associated to this include. That means that for the same include, you can use different configuration depending of the target you choose. For example, you may have a compose file dedicated for your dev environment, and the file you will use to the file you will use to specify your Kafka configuration or whatever won't be the same as the one you will use for your production bytes, for example. Okay.
So if I'm including from a Git URL, is it pulling down the whole repo and being able to build those images?
Yeah, exactly. It's done at the moment. We know that we have some discussion with our friend of BuildX. They are saying to us, you don't have to do that. So we are waiting for their PR, so be sure that we can just directly inline build and not copy the source code directly inside the host machine of the end user. So, that's why it's still experimental, for example, because we know that we can improve this part. Currently, it's worked well, but there is some flaw with this design, especially maybe some security stuff that we should address, and using the capability of BuildX to do that in line without copying the Git repo on the host machine will help us to address this kind of issue and maybe build faster than doing the copy of the Git repo, then build, blah, blah, blah. That will be directly a build, and we can use these services.
And Compose in Docker Desktop works with the new build functionality that was in the keynote today.
So if you subscribe to the new builder, the build functionality, Compose is already able to use that new builder. Docker Desktop is shipped at the moment with a specific version that could use that new builder. So it's almost the same version as the open source one, except that you know how to use that new builder, and you can enjoy the fast build directly with Compose.
And that's because that product is not GA yet.
Yeah, sure. So when it will be GA, we should expect that everything will be contributing back to the open source repo of Compose. And then, yeah, you will see how it works, but you can't access to the builder without subscribing to the program. So I don't think it will change a lot for the end user, but yeah, everything will be contributing back to the open source and public repo, and you will be able to see how it works. There is no dark magic, in fact, just mostly listing available builders and say, hey, I want to use that one.
Yeah. Does Docker Watch work with Docker Swarm?
So Compose Watch works with remote contexts. It is meant for development. So if you're using Swarm while developing, I would say, yes, that's fine, right? If it's a remote, it will copy whether it's local or not, because behind the scenes, what's actually happening when it copies in files or triggers a rebuild is it's using the Docker API. There's no bind mounts here or kind of stuff outside where it's sticking within the parts of the engine API that work with local or remote context, which includes Swarm, whether it's local or remote. But again, we are intending this for development purposes, right? When you're developing and doing so, I would not recommend, because it is when you run Watch, you have a Compose process that is running in your terminal foreground, showing you what's happening, the syncing, and that's what's doing the file watching on your host and triggering those copies or hitting those APIs to do a rebuild. It's really meant for, again, when you're working and you have that running versus as a way to have some sort of dynamic copying of files into containers in production. That's not something that we're trying to tackle with this because it just doesn't fit with the Compose model. Because typically when you deploy with Compose, for Swarm, for example, you run that, you run your up or your Swarm stack deploy, and once it's there, the command runs and then it's done because it is push that configuration to the engine, and now the engine is managing everything after that. Or Swarm is managing it, versus Compose Watch, which is this higher level dev feature where Compose itself is a long running process in managing stuff. But we're not intending it, for Compose to kind of be a long running orchestrator sidecar in production or anything like that. But yes, short answer, works with local context or remote context, which would include Swarm.
Thanks, Miles. Is there any plan to work with the Docker Engine team to support the depends on features, e.g. preserving container startup order after Docker restarts?
Yes, so Compose in some ways is downstream of the Moby project and the engine. So there are certain features in Compose that might be Compose specific because, again, Compose is doing a little bit of orchestration when launching things. And so it's really at that time of the up where it can do certain more in-depth options with dependencies than the engine does once it's deployed. And so I believe there's been open discussion there. There's open issues on the Moby project. And certainly if changes are brought in there, we will be able to adopt them. But that is otherwise not something that is possible to support because Compose is actually not running code after you deploy. The process is gone and the engine is managing it. So that's something we are in conversation with for all the issues, but that is a little bit more based on the Moby project, the engine's project's priorities and their decision.
So Han, maybe you can address when would developers want to choose running Kubernetes versus running Compose?
Oh, that's a pretty complex question. There's definitely a lot of different kinds of patterns that we've observed where people are using Compose in the larger context of Kubernetes. So we've seen people that still retain some use of Compose to do what I think of as like the minimum viable fidelity testing of just something that they need to quickly be able to understand, because it's not always feasible to essentially replicate whatever is the production version of Kubernetes in development as well. There's certainly approaches to do so, but I think what I particularly think is really valuable about Compose is that it's an abstraction that is at the right level for development. And Kubernetes, on the other hand, is an abstraction that includes a lot that is about scaling, about security, about these policies that are much more on the production side. So when we observe the usage of Compose in a context where there's some kind of a deploy to Kubernetes, there's sometimes this kind of ad hoc local development and testing that can still be very valuable in that circumstance. But if we're kind of looking to bridge a gap that is there, there genuinely is one, because I think we certainly see users who really prize that parity between development and production. And the aforementioned strength of Compose as a developer-oriented abstraction means that there are things that simply are not represented well within Compose that you may want to be able to test if ultimately you want to understand how the code changes you're making are going to affect the eventual deploy to production. So that is something that we are investigating, and there's hopefully more that we can say about that soon. And I certainly invite any of you to come chat with us in the Innovation Lounge, because that's a setting in which we can speak a little bit more about speculative and projects that are in progress. But I hope that at least gives a sketch of how we're understanding both the relationship and the gap between Compose and Kubernetes.
If I'm an online attendee, how can I help and give feedback for that effort?
There's always our public roadmap, as well as our Compose issues. And I wish I had a more readily available link here, but I myself am also always seeking to speak with people who are particularly interested in this problem, because we're trying to understand how to structure our roadmap so it meets the real world use cases that we're seeing with our customers. So you can email me. It's my name at docker.com. Perhaps that's one way to get in touch.
And there's the Docker community Slack as well.
Oh yes, let's not forget that.
Compose channel.
Yeah, that's a great place as well.
As a student new to Docker, what are the benefits of using Docker Compose in different environments like production, development, and testing?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. As a student new to Docker, what are the benefits of using Docker Compose in different environments like production, development, and testing?
Okay. So I think one of the main point here is that you can use the same compose file for the three environment and use maybe overrides or extents or capability compose offers you to just change the behavior, the configuration of the services depending of the environment you are targeting. So basically what we suggest to people to do is having a production file defined, so all your services defined in your main compose file, and what you can do after that is using override files or dedicated environment file, and use, for people who don't know, you can use compose and say docker compose -f, and you can pass multiple compose file to compose, and the first one will be the main one, and all the other one, what they will do is just merge and adapt the original one with the new configuration. So that way you may have only one configuration, the main configuration file ready for the production, and just use adaptation of the services for the different environments. So you don't have to rewrite your whole configuration for each environment. You just only specify the bits that needs to be changed to work locally against a dev cluster or maybe your staging environment and so on. So that's the power of Compose. You know, Compose, it's the base of the name. You can do any composition if you want. Now we have include also. That's, yeah, you have a lot of possibility to do that. Having one source of truth and then adapt it regarding your different use cases.
So Compose is a great tool due to its simplicity, right? Can you describe more about setting it up for like a local Raspberry Pi cluster and how how using Compose is the right tool for that?
Yeah, one of the great things, especially if you're talking about small board computers like Raspberry Pi or ARM devices, I love these. I'm really into them. That's why I got the mic. Is Compose has adopted a lot of the multi-platform features that are available in Build. So you can set things up based on your configuration. So for example, you might have a case where you're working on an AMD 64 system, an Intel system, but you're building for ARM 64, and you always need to run that. And even if you're developing locally to test it out, you want to be running under emulation so that you can actually test with ARM 64 because maybe you have, for example, a lot of vendors have specific cross-compiler tool chains that you need to use. So Compose can help make that very structured because you can set up your Compose file and really set all the platforms different, you know, between build and run. And maybe you actually do have a project that works cross-platform. You know, a lot of modern languages, Go and Rust, as well as interpreted languages, are great at running on pretty much every platform you could imagine. So in that case as well, Compose can help you because it makes sure that when you're working on your laptop and running, it's running under the native architecture of your machine. But then if you connect to a remote Docker engine on your Raspberry Pi, for example, which is really easy if you haven't done, you can do Docker host and use SSH, an SSH URL, and it will SSH in and connect to the Docker engine on that machine. So it's a really quick, secure way to connect to other devices. And so then if you were to do Compose up there, you can use the right architecture now on that for that device. So it can be a great way for, especially if you're prototyping, because a lot of the boards are slower. They don't, you know, they're not really fast to compile. So you can do, you know, nice things like compile on your machine and test and then go there. But again, if you have specific needs for one platform or the other, you can make sure you have that defined correctly, where you're not passing a bunch of flags every time you run a command.
So this is a question for probably each of the panelists to answer. It's, what's the most requested feature you've seen that Compose doesn't have?
I think well, it has it now, but includes was a really, really big one. And figuring out the semantics there. There are also, I think, you know, it was mentioned some of the dependency semantics as well.
Yeah, as you already take the include one, I will say something to bridge the gap with Kubernetes world. So that's definitely something people ask to us a lot. It's a really difficult topic, especially with all the possible configuration you may have on the Kube world. So if we do something very opinionated, people will complain about the fact that we are using Helm over customized, or that we not using Grace, or blah, blah, blah. And there is so many ways to, and Compose is so simple regarding the model of Kube that at some point we need to make decision how to transform things to the Kube world. And yeah, so let's see what the future will be on that. And we will try to propose you something at some point, but for now, it's still something missing.
Yeah, and I think the first thing that came to mind with that question for me is the way that currently people use Compose to bring up a lot of the containers that they need for development, but often that's not sufficient, right? There may be a database that needs to be populated. There may be databases that need to be authenticated and connected to. So there's a lot of work that happens around just bringing up those containers themselves that people often, will have some scripting or some kind of workarounds for, but there's a way that I think Compose is so close, or it seems as though it should be able to manage more of that setup, because I often think about how part of the strength of Compose is that you can just do Compose up and then you're ready to do development. But, in some cases you're not exactly, because, you might still need to get everything into the right state at the right time. And I often think how developers have this incredible appetite for this kind of toil, as we just described, of like, you just kind of get used to, all right, I got to run this, got to run that, got to do this and that. But especially as we're thinking about this form of automation, of trying to get you and keep with you in that state of flow, being able to manage more of those other pieces, that's not just getting the set of containers properly configured with their dependencies running, seems like a thing that's missing.
And you, Jeff?
All right, so I was surprised I didn't hear anybody mention init containers,
Yep.
which is one that we get requested all the time, and we're thinking about it. So we're trying to fit that into the roadmap. We got
Also,
another.
templating is another big one.
Which one?
Full templating support, which is something we're always trying to balance in terms of how dynamic Compose files are, because it's somewhere between a declarative and not completely declarative model, and so we want to try and manage that complexity. And so that often is, we understand and we get that request, but there are downsides to having a Turing complete templating system within YAML. I also am going to awkwardly leave this panel because I am going to be giving a talk in a few minutes on 15 tips for Compose. You have plenty of time to walk. I have to get a microphone and computer and stuff. So don't worry, don't panic. If you're interested, I'd love to see you. And thank you all. They're going to keep answering questions.
Thanks, Miles.
And maybe another one. Lifecycle hooks. That's something people, and that's linked to your point, the init question. People often want to be able to do stuff before the container is started, or right after the container is started, or just before it goes down, and so on. So that's also something we have in mind at some point.
Yeah, lifecycle hooks is definitely a well requested. We got a question here that sounds like a troubleshooting problem, so I think we can help. Is there a way to use locally available images that were loaded from a file instead of downloaded from a registry? Currently, Compose tries to pull them by default.
We had this question last week internally, and yeah, there is a possibility to do that. You can, there is a pull policy available. So you can, for each services, define what should be the pull policy, and there is an option that will use available local images instead of pulling the images by default. So that way you can use that to not download the image each time.
Great, we're almost out of time.
Yep, just got a few minutes left here.
What are what's a question you haven't heard that you expected to hear today, Han?
Oh.
Turn it back on you.
That's a curveball. That's a good one.
Because I know you prepared some answers ahead of time.
I did not. Yeah, I think where my mind has been is thinking about ways that we can continue evolving Compose as an open source, like a beloved open source product that I think is very well used and is a significant portion of overall Docker desktop usage. So I think I was, maybe the last question did get a little bit at it, but I was reflecting on ways that our team is trying to be very strategic about, directing our own energies, because Compose has an extremely wide range of uses, and a lot of what we try to do is to not necessarily, because we can't directly address, all of the different use cases and needs in the exact detail, but there's a sort of an act of reconciling that we need to do. So that's where my mind was at.
No, I think each time I go to conferences and see end user, there is so many different questions that I didn't expect any very specific question. So no.
I encourage everybody to join the Docker community Slack, ask questions about Compose in there, as all the other Docker products in there. Go to the Compose GitHub repo. Look at the issues. If you see things that you like, thumbs up it, +1 it. We do look at that stuff daily, all the time. So the community feedback is excellent way for us to connect with everybody and understand what we should be focused on next. And we look forward to working with all of you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And for those who are remote, please connect to the channel and see my last conference.
Yes.
That will start in
15 tips.
Yeah, 15 tips.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.
For your Compose experience, yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.